this matter on pruning, and the final wind-up on pruning is how to get rid of the prunings. And remember, out in the lab, I repeatedly told you, and some of you I had to keep. I kicked the prunings out in the vine row, but sometimes I felt like kicking the pruners to get those prunings out in the middle so that we can dispose of them. Now, just to give you a little bit of serious thinking for a moment, in some parts of the world where they don't have the great amount of fuel and wood and so forth that we have in this country, grape prunings are an important part of their industry. And in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, those areas where they have no forest and no oil, at least at least for the common people, and these people will have to have something to cook with. A very important thing is to use grape prunings. And I've been kicking myself for the past day or two over this because why I didn't take a picture of it. But when I was in Argentina, for example, 2 or 3 years ago, I saw piles of grape prunings around the farmhouses as big as the farmhouse, piled up to use for cooking. And this is true in Greece, and it's, I think, isn't it, Poppy? Don't you use prunings quite a bit? In small villages in the country and so forth, they use to cook. And in Turkey and all those areas where there's no forest and so on. And in Mexico, they use these prunings very much as a wood supply. As a matter of fact, I got my last PhD grad student in this country on a grant from Ford Foundation, partly because of a great impassioned plea in a letter about the necessity for expanding the grape growing in northern Mexico so that poor people would have fuel to cook their chili and beans with. Because before that, you know, in Argentina, they stockpile this stuff, they say in piles as big as their house. But for some reason, these Mexicans haven't learned that. And before they went into grape growing, they used to use cotton stalks to cook with. But they wouldn't stockpile them. And I've seen them going out in a plowed field, hunting around and picking up one stalk here and one way over there and one there after it had been plowed up. Instead of cutting them down and piling them up around their adobe houses before they plowed them up. They wouldn't think about that, so they'd go out and pick them up and scratch them out of the plowed up soil later on. Well, you can imagine then what grape prunings will do to giving them some fuel. Okay, that's true then in some of these countries that are short on fuel. Another use perhaps for prunings would be for cattle feed. But it makes a real starvation diet for cattle. And now it isn't as bad as it sounds, because what they do is put them in ball mills and beat it up and grind it up into a meal. But still it is pretty low. It's just about, according to my notes that I've dug out here, it's just about equal to barley straw, which means that a sheep or a goat or a cow would eat it just under absolute extreme starvation conditions. For example, barley straw has 4.3% crude protein, and dormant canes have 4%. So it's a pretty poor food. You can dry it and grind it up and mix it with other materials and stretch it out to give them, bulk instead of nutrition. But so far as our country is concerned, we haven't gotten that hard up yet that we need to worry about using the dormant canes for food. Now, the summertime shoots aren't a bad food for cattle. And in Europe, you know, where, as I've told some of you in the Monday afternoon sections, where they plant the grapes vines close together, about 3 by 4 feet, and pour on the fertilizer to make them grow fast, and then that gives them something to do. Then they have to go out about every month and cut them off because they're growing too fast because they put on so much fertilizer. So when they do that and head them back, then those cuttings it's a green source of food. It's just about like any green material might be for food supply for livestock. But again, we're not going to spend time and money in this country to go out and cut tops off to feed to the cattle. So we get down and you say, well, it's not good for, we don't need it for fuel, we don't need it for cattle feed, but maybe it's good for fertilizer. But it isn't very good for fertilizer either. Let me have it. And I told you in the fertilizer lecture I'd give you some of this information. And prunings, on a NPK basis, on nitrogen, contain about 0.3% dry weight, which is about 6 pounds of nitrogen per ton. So you see there's not much nitrogen. On phosphorus, it's even lower. It's 0.05%, which is less than the phosphorus in this paper probably. And that gives you about 1 pound per ton. And the potassium gives you again about the same as the nitrogen, about 0.3%, which gives you about 6 pounds per ton. So the thing you might remember here is that you can forget phosphorus in it, and the nitrogen and potassium are about the same at about 0.3%, which gives you about 6 pounds per ton. Well, that doesn't tell you anything until you see how many tons per acre. And generally speaking, you get 2 to 3 tons of prunings per acre. So you see, you're not exactly over-fertilizing the vines if you plow under the prunings at about anywhere from around 10 to 15 pounds of nitrogen per acre from the prunings. So you're no good then it's no good then to use the prunings as a primary or as even as a supplementary source for nitrogen. Now I told you also that I would, at this lecture, I told you that pomace, you might wonder why this comes in. I wonder myself why I put it here. But pomace, you know, the squeezed skins and seeds after you've pressed them for wine aren't too bad compared to the prunings. The pomace runs 1.5 to 2.5% nitrogen, and then this can give you about 40 pounds per acre. 40 pounds per ton, excuse me. 40 pounds per ton. If it's 2%, of course, it's 40 pounds. And on phosphorus, it runs about 0.5%. But none of you better tell me you need phosphorus for the vineyard. And potassium, again, just like the nitrogen over here in the prunings, it figures out to about the same thing, about 1.5 to 2.5%, which gives you about 40 pounds. Can you people over there see this? Get it? Nitrogen, 1.5 to 2.5%, I'm giving you an average of about 40 pounds per ton. Phosphorus, about 10 pounds. Potassium, about the same as nitrogen. So both prunings and pomace run about the same for nitrogen and potassium on this. But, so on prunings at least, then getting back to what we're talking about over here, you're not getting much out of fertilizer. It's no good for fuel, it's no good for cattle feed, it's not much good for fertilizer. So what we really boil down to is that in this country, prunings are nothing but a nuisance, just an additional expense in your vineyard. How to get rid of them. You might say, if you're going to give any value whatsoever to prunings, is on that the greatest value might be to improve the soil texture, certainly that surface soil when you cut them in. Remember I told you that even the biggest ones break down within a year, so that they don't last that long, but at least during the current season, if you were to cut them in, disc them in well, they would lighten and loosen the surface soil and add to water penetration. But the problem is that this is only really useful on heavy soils. That's where you need it. And the heavy soils are in the coastal counties, generally speaking. And generally speaking, in the coastal counties, at least in the old vineyards, they're so closely planted you can't get in with a big heavy disc to disc them up, which you should do if they were heavy, if you want to really work them in, because of the close planting. But they do use big heavy discs down in the San Joaquin Valley where you have 12-foot spacing. And as we go to more and more percentage of our vineyards in the coastal county at 12-foot spacing, maybe the working them in with a good heavy disc will probably be of some value. In the San Joaquin Valley, I say they use big shredders to shred them, and these shredders are, well, they sort of have a wheel that rotates with some flanges on it like this against a permanent part like this, which flanges on it, and then it moves this way and goes this way, and then picks up the brush and slams it into here and breaks it up. It doesn't shred it up into flour dust, but it breaks it up into 6, 8, 10-inch pieces, which don't give you any trouble. But those machines like that are so big and so expensive that they cost maybe $3,000 or so to have a shredding machine, so you can hardly afford that. So much of that is done by what we call contract, or where you, that's not the word I want, by custom work, where you arrange and pay somebody to come in and use his big shredder to shred your brush. And if you recall some of those slides I showed about nitrogen fertilization and so forth, quite often they'll put the brush into alternate middles. They'll prune 2 vines into this middle and two rows into this middle, so that they only have to go down alternate middles this year, and next year they'll reverse it and put it back in the other way. Another cheaper way to do it, which you'll see illustrated out here, is what we call a roto beater. A roto beater. And what this is a cotton stalk knocker downer. It's the machine that really is sold most in California to beat up the cotton stalks in the cotton fields. So it amused me sometimes to say a cotton stalk knocker downer. But anyway, what it is, and that's all you need for your notes, is this is an oversized rotary lawnmower. That's all it is. A rotary lawnmower, but a great big size. Instead of being 30 inches in diameter, it's 5 feet in diameter. And you'll see this in action out in our own vineyard. And this does a fairly decent job of beating up the prunings, provided you're not growing Thompson seedless down in the San Joaquin Valley. In other words, most of this stuff that's finger size, this thing does a fairly decent job breaking it up. And instead of costing over $3,000 or so per instrument, per piece of equipment, you may buy it for $600 or $700. And that's the one that's normally used. But in some cases, you'll find in the coast counties they use what we call a buck rake. A buck rake. And this is nothing except a gadget with about 3-foot long tongs out in front that'll go along through the vineyard on the front of a tractor and just pick these things up and carry them out to the end of the row. So this is sometimes done. Sometimes, even in some of these smaller vineyards in the coastal counties, I've been amused at seeing them carrying them out by hand, carrying the prunings out by hand to the end of the row. Actually, in California, there's no, except for the physical problem of these things getting fouled up in your cultivation equipment and so forth, there's no real problem. In Europe and in some parts of the world, these things harbor insects, beetles and so forth, so that you've got to get them out. In some places down around Lodi and so on, you may want to get them out because of them carrying dead arm disease, which we'll talk about later, a fungus problem, which you may want to get out. But generally speaking, in California, you have no disease problem. It's a physical interference with the vineyard operations that makes you want to get them out. So why should you, with some of these little small, weak-growing vines in the coastal counties, why should you go through and carry them out by hand? When you're going to disc up that mustard crop, which is waist high, you ought to be able to disc up these rather small prunings that you get off the vines. But people have been carried away with this business of disposal of prunings to the point where we'll show you out here in the vineyard one of these days an old, it looks like an old funeral coffin made of rusted iron, in which they pulled it through the vineyards and threw the cuttings in and burned them and kept the thing going. Just pile them in and burn them, move on and pile in some more and burn them and so on. And in the old days, the real old days, they used to have a mule they would pull us along, and they could just move him up, hit him once, and move him up about 10 vines, and burn some more, and so on. Winkler says they damaged more vines than they helped by the fire too hot close to the vines. But we have one out there. We'll show you when we go out. So anyway, then, this whole business of prunings is, as I say, is nothing but a problem. We get rid of them by disking them or by using that rototiller, and that's why it's extremely important that you get them out from under the vines and out of the middle of the avenue where where the equipment can work them over. And that's the essence of what I want to say, is that probably the thing that can gripe a vineyard foreman more than anything else is just dropping those prunings right on the vines, when you should be able to throw them out at least so that they can get to them with equipment. Okay, any question on this?
Sometimes they cut a cover crop down instead of disking it under. Will the equipment they use to cut it down speed up the cuttings, the prunings sufficiently?
This is one I'm not sure. Only down at Kearney where they cut the cover crop, did they just use this rotobeater? Is it just a rotobeater, or do they use a regular mower? Because the rotobeater is just, as I say, an oversized lawnmower. Yeah. And so it can beat up the thing too. Because I was wondering myself, when thinking about this lecture, whether or not down there where they do just cut the cover crop, whether they cut it with a rotobeater, or did they use a special mower? So if he answered your question, they used a rotobeater. Okay, now Dr. Alley will be giving the next 3 or 4 lectures. Anything you want to say in just 1 minute or so about your next lecture or two? Okay. All right, let them out. Okay, it'll be an indoor lab again this afternoon.